The church hall was full of laughter, music, and the sound of people chatting over cups of coffee. The town's annual community event had always been a lively day, a time for everyone to gather, showcase their talents, and celebrate together. On this bright Saturday morning, the stage was set with flowers, a polished black piano at the center, and rows of wooden chairs filled with smiling faces. Children ran around holding balloons, and the air buzzed with excitement. At the back of the hall, an elderly nun slowly made her way inside. She moved quietly, almost unnoticed, her small frame wrapped in a simple gray habit. Her hands trembled slightly as she held onto her rosary, and her kind eyes scanned the crowd with gentle warmth. She didn't come to draw attention. She just wanted to listen, to feel the joy of music again. She found a seat near the corner, close enough to hear, but far enough to stay out of the way. The young performers were getting ready, some tuning guitars, others warming up their voices. Parents whispered encouragement, phones ready to record every note. On stage, the event's host, a cheerful man in his 30s, introduced the next act, a group of teenagers performing a lively song on piano and violin. The audience clapped along as the music filled the hall. The nun smiled softly, her foot tapping lightly to the rhythm. She loved music. It had been a part of her life for as long as she could remember. Every note she heard brought back memories of the piano she once played in the quiet chapel of her convent. Long ago, when her hands were steadier and her body stronger. When the young group finished, the hall erupted in applause. The host praised them warmly before inviting anyone else who wished to perform. A few hands shot up. A little boy played Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, making the audience chuckle affectionately. Another young woman sang a sweet song, her voice trembling with nervousness. As the host looked around for the next performer, the elderly nun quietly raised her hand. Her voice was soft but clear. "May I play something?" she asked. For a moment, the host didn't realize she was talking to him. When he turned and saw her, his smile faltered slightly, not out of disrespect but surprise. The hall went quiet as people turned to look. She looked so delicate sitting there in her old habit, her fingers thin and shaking slightly. "Oh, sister, that's very kind of you," the host said politely. "But the piano keys are a bit heavy." "It might be difficult," a few people nodded. One woman whispered, "She's so old. Maybe she just wants to try, but it could be hard for her." Another muttered softly, "Maybe we should let the kids finish first." The nun smiled gently, not offended. She nodded in understanding and folded her hands. "Of course," she said. "Please continue." She didn't argue, didn't insist. She simply sat back and listened as the next performer took the stage. But not everyone forgot about her. A young girl sitting 2 seats away kept glancing at the nun. She couldn't have been more than 12, her hair tied in a messy ponytail, a notebook on her lap filled with drawings of pianos and music notes. She had noticed how the nun's eyes glowed whenever someone played. The girl leaned closer and whispered, "Do you play piano, sister?" The nun smiled again, her eyes soft. "I used to, dear. A long time ago. Were you good?" the girl asked innocently. The nun chuckled quietly. "I loved it more than anything. I taught music for many years. My fingers don't move as fast now, but the heart remembers." The girl's curiosity grew. "Where did you teach?" "At an orphanage," the nun replied. "We didn't have much, but there was an old piano in the chapel. Every night I played for the children before they went to sleep. They said it made them dream of beautiful things." The girl's eyes widened. "That sounds wonderful." "It was," the nun said softly, her gaze drifting toward the piano on stage. "Music is a prayer in its own way. You don't always need words to speak to hearts." The young girl smiled, inspired by her gentle tone. She didn't understand everything the nun meant, but she could feel the kindness in her words. As the performances went on, the girl couldn't stop thinking about what she'd said. She started whispering to a few people nearby, asking if anyone knew who the nun was. One elderly woman in the back overheard and turned to her with a nostalgic smile. "That's Sister Agnes," she said quietly. "Years ago, she used to play at weddings and services here. Her music could make anyone cry. People used to call her the soul pianist. She played from the heart." The girl's mouth dropped open. "Really?" The woman nodded. "It's true." But after her hands got weak, she stopped. She hasn't played in years. The young girl looked at the stage again. The shiny black piano sat under the light, untouched for a while as performers prepared their instruments. She turned toward the host, who was standing near the microphone chatting with someone. Gathering her courage, the girl stood up and walked to him. She tugged on his sleeve and whispered something. The host bent down, listening with a puzzled expression. His eyes flicked toward the nun, then back to the girl. The girl spoke again, her small hands moving as she tried to convince him. The host hesitated. "Sweetheart, I don't know if she can—" "She can," the girl interrupted. "Please let her, just once. You'll see." He looked uncertain but couldn't ignore the determination in her voice. The audience had started noticing the exchange. A few murmurs spread across the hall as the host finally sighed and smiled. "All right," he said into the microphone. "We have one more special request." All eyes turned to the elderly nun. The host smiled at her gently. "Sister, would you like to play for us?" The room went silent. The nun blinked in surprise, then slowly stood up. Her steps were careful and small as she walked toward the piano. A few people watched nervously, worried she might stumble, but she moved with quiet dignity. The young girl rushed to pull the chair back for her. "Thank you, child," the nun whispered kindly. As she sat down, the crowd leaned forward. Even those who had doubted her earlier now looked curious. The piano seemed almost too big for her, its black surface gleaming under the light. She placed her trembling fingers on the keys but didn't press them yet. For a few seconds, she just closed her eyes and took a slow, steady breath. The hall was so quiet that everyone could hear the ticking of the old clock on the wall. Then, with a soft motion, her hands began to move. The first notes were faint, a little shaky but pure. Something about the sound instantly changed the atmosphere. The light chatter died completely. The melody she played was simple, like a lullaby but filled with emotion. Her fingers glided over the keys with surprising grace for someone her age. Each note carried warmth, as if she was speaking through the piano instead of words. The young girl's eyes widened, her heart racing. The same people who had doubted her earlier now sat frozen, listening. The nun's music grew stronger, her hands steadying with each measure. The melody told a story, one of love, faith, and time passing. It wasn't just music. It felt like a memory coming to life, something the piano itself had been waiting years to feel again. Tears appeared in the eyes of a few older listeners. The host stood silently at the side, his earlier hesitation replaced by awe. When the nun finally lifted her hands from the keys, the last note lingered in the air for a long, tender moment. The room was completely still, as if no one wanted to break the spell. Then slowly applause began to rise. At first it was gentle, respectful. But within seconds the entire hall was standing, clapping and cheering. Some people wiped tears from their cheeks. The young girl ran up to her, hugging her tightly. "You were amazing," the girl whispered. The nun smiled softly, her eyes glistening. "Thank you, child. It's been a long time since I heard that sound," the applause. "But I'm just grateful I could play again." The host stepped forward, shaking her hand. "Sister, that was incredible. You moved us all," she nodded humbly. "Music belongs to everyone. I only borrowed it for a moment." The crowd clapped again, louder than before. For the first time in years, Sister Agnes, though frail and old, felt the same joy she once did in her youth. As she walked back to her seat, the young girl whispered to her, "I think the world needs to hear you again." The nun chuckled softly, resting her trembling hands on her lap. "Maybe, dear. Or maybe it just needed a reminder that every soul, no matter how quiet or old, still has a song to share." That night, no one in that hall forgot what they saw. None of them expected an elderly nun to touch their hearts that deeply with a piano's keys. But she did. And that moment was just the beginning of something the whole world would soon come to know. The performance that day stayed in everyone's mind long after the event ended. The sound of the piano still echoed in the hearts of those who had heard it. Some said they could still feel the peace in the notes she played. The host, who had first hesitated to let her perform, couldn't stop thinking about the look on her face when she touched the keys. So calm, so full of quiet strength. The next morning, videos of her playing started to spread across social media. Someone had filmed her performance, and it had reached far more people than anyone expected. The short clip showed an old nun sitting at the piano, her frail fingers moving gracefully as the crowd watched in silence. The comments filled quickly. People from all over the world wrote about how her music made them cry, how it reminded them of their own grandparents, their faith, or the beauty of simple things. But while the world was just discovering her, Sister Agnes spent the next morning the same way she always did, sweeping the small courtyard of the convent, feeding the birds and lighting candles in the chapel. She didn't even know her video had gone viral. To her it was just a small moment of joy, a chance to play again after so many years. One of the younger sisters came running to her, holding a tablet.
"Sister, people are talking about you everywhere."
"They loved your music," she said, excitement glowing in her eyes. The elderly nun smiled softly, a bit puzzled. "Talking about me?" "Yes. Look, there are thousands of comments. Everyone says your piano playing touched their hearts." Sister Agnes took the tablet carefully, her hands trembling a little. She looked at the screen, seeing her own wrinkled face frozen mid-song. The comment section was full of kind words. "This made me cry. She plays like an angel. I haven't felt this peaceful in years." She read quietly for a moment, then gave a small laugh. "Well, I suppose music travels faster than I thought." The younger sister giggled. "You're famous now." The nun shook her head gently. "No, child. The music is famous, not me." That afternoon she sat alone in the small chapel, the light from the stained glass windows coloring the floor in shades of gold and red. She looked at the old wooden piano in the corner. It had been there since before she joined the convent, its surface scratched and keys slightly yellowed. She remembered all the times she had played it, early mornings before prayers, quiet nights after the children at the orphanage had gone to bed. The memories came back one by one, each more vivid than the last. Many years ago, when she was still young, she had joined the convent with a heart full of dreams. Music had always been her gift, but she didn't want to use it for fame. She wanted to use it for peace. When the head sister asked her what skill she wanted to dedicate to God, she answered, "My music." She was sent to a small orphanage run by the convent in the countryside. It was a humble place, surrounded by tall trees and the soft hum of crickets at night. The children there had been through much pain. Some had lost their parents, others had been abandoned. They arrived scared, quiet, and unsure of the world. The first night she stayed there, she found an old piano in the chapel. Dust covered the lid, and half the keys were out of tune. But when she pressed one, even with the creaky sound it made, she smiled. "We'll fix you," she whispered to it. Every evening after that, she gathered the children in the chapel. She played lullabies and hymns, songs of hope and love. Slowly, the children began to sing along. Their laughter returned, and the once silent orphanage became filled with music and joy. There was one little boy in particular who never spoke. He had been brought in by a local couple who found him wandering near the train station. He was always quiet, hiding behind others, afraid to talk. But one evening, while Sister Agnes was playing a gentle tune, she noticed him humming. It was the first sound he had made in weeks. From that night onward, he sat beside her every evening as she played. He never missed a single song. Eventually, he learned how to play too. She taught him patiently, guiding his tiny hands across the keys. Music became their way of speaking when words were too hard to find. Years later, that boy grew up to be a music teacher. He often said that everything he knew began with that nun and her piano. Sister Agnes smiled faintly at the memory as she ran her fingers across the old chapel piano now. The sound was faint but warm. She didn't realize that the same boy, now a grown man, had seen her viral video the night before. When he recognized her, his eyes filled with tears. He had not seen her in decades, yet her music was exactly the same. He decided to visit her. A few days later, the convent received a letter from a local school requesting Sister Agnes to visit and give a short talk to the students about her life and music. The head sister showed it to her during breakfast. "They said your performance inspired their entire music club," she said, smiling. Sister Agnes laughed gently. "I'm not sure what I could teach them. I only play what I feel." "Maybe that's exactly what they need to hear," the head sister replied. A week later, she was taken to the school auditorium. The students greeted her with wide smiles, holding flowers and posters. The piano on stage was newer than any she'd ever touched, shining under bright lights. She was nervous at first. She hadn't spoken to such a large crowd in years. But when she saw the eager faces of the young students, her heart softened. One of the teachers stepped forward to introduce her. The moment Sister Agnes heard his voice, she froze for a second. It was the same boy from the orphanage, now grown, confident, and kind-eyed. He smiled warmly at her, his voice catching slightly as he said, This is the woman who taught me that music can heal hearts. Her eyes filled with tears. She couldn't believe it. Time had taken so much, her strength, her youth, but not the connection music had built all those years ago. After his introduction, she sat down at the piano again. The hall grew quiet. She began to play the same song she had played at the orphanage so many years before, the one that had helped that frightened little boy find his voice. As the melody filled the room, students leaned forward, some closing their eyes. The teacher stood near the stage, smiling through tears. When the song ended, the applause was soft but heartfelt. She looked at the young faces and said, "Music is a language that doesn't need translation. It speaks to the soul. When you play, don't play to impress, play to connect." After the event, students lined up to meet her. Some wanted autographs, others just wanted to thank her. One girl asked, "Sister, how do you make your music sound like it's alive?" She smiled. "Because I play what I feel. Every note has a story. Even silence has meaning." That evening, as she returned to the convent, she looked out the window of the car. The sunset painted the sky orange and gold. She thought about how strange life was, that after so many years of quiet, her music had somehow found its way back into the world. But in her heart, she didn't think of herself as someone special. She was just a woman who loved music, who found peace in its sound. She never imagined that her story was about to reach even further, that soon she would be invited to play again, not just in her small town, but in places far beyond it. Back in her room, she placed her rosary on the table and whispered a quiet prayer of thanks. She didn't pray for fame or praise. She prayed that whoever heard her music would find comfort in it, just as she always had. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, carrying with it the faint sound of a song, her song, that had traveled farther than she could have ever dreamed. And though she didn't know it yet, the world was already waiting to hear her play again. Word about Sister Agnes had spread far beyond her small town. Emails and letters arrived at the convent from schools, music clubs, and even small concert halls. People had seen the videos online and wanted her to play again. Some requested private performances for children. Others asked for small gatherings of music lovers. Yet, despite the praise and the attention, she remained quiet and humble, never imagining herself as anything special. She only wanted to share what she had loved for decades, the language of music. One morning, a letter arrived that made the sisters pause. It was from the director of a nearby city's cultural hall, a beautiful venue where local musicians performed every month. The letter explained that a special concert was being planned, a tribute to musicians who had dedicated their lives to inspiring others. They had seen the video of Sister Agnes playing and were asking her to be the featured performer. The younger sisters were excited. "Sister, you have to do it. This is a chance for everyone to hear you," one of them said, holding the letter. Sister Agnes took the paper in her hands and read it carefully. Her eyes moved over each word. She could feel the weight of the request, the importance of what they were asking. For a moment, doubt crept in. Could she still perform for such a large audience? Would her hands hold steady? Would she be able to convey the same emotion that came so naturally at the piano in the quiet of her chapel? She sat quietly, folding the letter and placing it on the table. "Perhaps," she said softly, "if it will help someone, I will try." Preparations began soon after. The cultural hall was stunning, with bright stage lights, red velvet curtains, and rows of seats that could hold hundreds. The piano was polished and tuned perfectly, gleaming under the warm lights. The young sisters insisted on accompanying her for moral support, while some children from the orphanage she had once taught were invited to watch. They were now teenagers, each carrying their own story of hope, growth, and music learned from her. The night of the concert arrived. Sister Agnes dressed simply in her gray habit, but her presence filled the hall. Backstage, she could hear the soft murmurs of the audience. People whispered her name, some recognizing her from the viral video, others curious about the elderly nun who had touched so many hearts. Her hands shook slightly as she approached the piano. The spotlight cast a warm circle of light around her, making her seem small yet radiant. She took a deep breath, closed her eyes for a moment, and whispered a silent prayer. The first few notes were cautious, almost hesitant. The audience leaned forward, sensing the quiet tension. But as her fingers found the keys, the sound that emerged was gentle and alive. It carried a story, of time passing, of memories cherished, of love shared through music. The young girl who had first convinced the host at the town event sat in the front row, her eyes wide with awe. She had come with her mother, eager to see Sister Agnes play again. She reached for her mother's hand, squeezing it tightly as the music began to fill the hall. Sister Agnes's playing grew more confident with every note. Her hands moved with a grace that seemed almost effortless, even though she had worried they might tremble. Each chord, each melody felt personal, as if she were speaking directly to each listener's heart. Tears rolled down the cheeks of many in the audience. Some remembered their own childhoods, some thought of loved ones lost, while others simply felt the beauty of the music in a way words could never describe. The elderly nun on the stage had transformed the hall into a sanctuary of emotion. Backstage, the director watched quietly, amazed. He had seen many talented musicians in his career, but few had such a direct connection to the audience.
She doesn't just play, he whispered to an assistant.
She speaks through the piano. After the first piece, the audience clapped gently, almost reverently. Sister Agnes paused, her hands hovering over the keys. She looked out at the sea of faces, some young, some old, all touched by the moment. She smiled softly, realizing that music had a power far beyond what she had imagined. The next piece she played was one she had composed in her youth, a hymn she had written for the children at the orphanage. The melody was simple, but it carried with it decades of love, hope, and care. Her fingers danced across the keys, and the music seemed to fill every corner of the hall. A few teenagers in the audience, children she had taught many years ago, whispered to each other. "She remembers us," one said. "She's playing the song she used to play for us at the orphanage." The music stirred something deep in the hearts of the audience. They could feel the stories embedded in each note, the laughter of children, the quiet prayers in a chapel, the moments of doubt and triumph. Even those who had never met her felt connected to her journey. Halfway through the performance, a young woman in the front row lifted her phone and began recording, capturing the beauty of the moment. She knew that the world needed to see this too. The elderly nun, who had been underestimated, ignored, and almost forgotten, was now showing the audience what true talent, devotion, and heart could accomplish. Sister Agnes didn't notice the camera. She didn't play for fame or attention. She played for the music itself, for the stories it could tell, and for the people who needed to hear it. As she played the final notes, the hall fell silent once more. The last chord lingered in the air like a gentle sigh. For a moment, no one moved. Then slowly, the applause began. It started quietly, polite, almost hesitant, but within seconds, the clapping grew into a thunderous roar. People rose to their feet, cheering, shouting words of admiration and gratitude. Some cried openly, overwhelmed by the power of the music. The young girl from the town event ran up to her afterward, throwing her arms around Sister Agnes. "You did it again," she exclaimed. "You made everyone feel it." The nun hugged her gently. "It is not me who makes them feel," she said softly. "It is the music." Backstage, the director stepped forward and shook her hand. "I have never seen anything like that," he said. "You brought the hall to life. People will remember this performance forever." Sister Agnes smiled humbly, her heart full. "If even one person leaves here feeling hope, I have done my duty." After the concert, the audience lingered, not wanting to leave the hall. Many approached her, sharing personal stories of how music had touched their lives. Some spoke of loss, some of happiness, some simply of the beauty of the notes she had played. Every conversation reminded her that music was more than sound. It was connection, memory, and feeling. That night, as she returned to the convent, her body was tired, but her spirit was light. She had faced the fear of performing again in front of so many people, and the music had not failed her. She realized that despite the years, despite the frailty of her body, the soul of music within her had remained strong. In the days that followed, invitations continued to arrive. People wanted her to play at more schools, at small concerts, even at charity events. The young girl who had first encouraged her stayed in touch, helping share her story online and encouraging others to seek her out. Sister Agnes understood that her life had changed in a way she had never expected. She was no longer just a quiet nun playing in the corners of her small chapel. She had become a symbol of hope, a reminder that talent and heart do not fade with age. But even with all the attention, she remained the same humble woman she had always been. She still woke up early to light candles in the chapel. She still walked through the garden, feeding the birds and sweeping the paths. She still played quietly in the evenings, practicing for the next performance. Yet every time she sat at a piano, whether in a small chapel or a grand hall, she felt the same thrill as she had all those years ago. She knew that her music carried more than notes. It carried life, love, and the stories of those she had touched. And though the world was beginning to notice her, she remained patient, humble, and grateful, understanding that her journey was not about fame, but about sharing something beautiful and eternal. After that first concert in the city, Sister Agnes's life slowly began to change. Not in ways she had expected, but in quiet, meaningful ways that touched her heart deeply. Letters and messages kept arriving at the convent. People she had never met wrote about how her music had brought them comfort, hope, or simply a moment of peace in their busy lives. Some told her that her performance had helped them through a difficult day, reminded them of loved ones, or made them feel emotions they thought they had long forgotten. The young girl who had first encouraged her at the small-town event kept helping share these stories. She would show Sister Agnes messages on her tablet, letters from children, adults, even elderly people who had watched the videos online. Each one told a story of connection, of lives touched by something so simple as music. One morning, Sister Agnes received a letter from a hospital in a nearby town. They had seen the video of her playing and asked if she could visit the children's ward. The hospital was full of young patients fighting illness, and they wanted her to play for them, hoping that the music might bring joy, or at least a moment of escape. She paused as she read it, her hands trembling slightly. Visiting a hospital was very different from a concert hall. The children were fragile, their lives filled with uncertainty, but she felt a quiet certainty deep inside that music could reach them in a way words never could. A few days later, she arrived at the hospital. The nurses guided her through bright hallways lined with colorful drawings, posters, and balloons. Children in their beds looked up curiously, some shy, some brave. She smiled gently, moving slowly from room to room, greeting each child with a soft word and a kind hand on their shoulder. Finally, she reached a small music room where a piano stood in the corner. Some of the children were too weak to leave their beds, so their parents brought them close to the open doors. She sat at the piano, her fingers hovering above the keys, taking a deep breath. The room was silent, expectant. Then she began to play. The first notes were soft and delicate, like a gentle whisper. The children listened carefully, some closing their eyes, some moving their fingers as if trying to touch the music. The melody she chose was light, comforting, a tune she had composed many years ago to soothe frightened children at the orphanage. She let the music carry her feelings, letting every note reach the listeners with warmth. A little boy in the corner, who had not spoken for weeks, turned his head slowly toward the sound. His mother's eyes filled with tears as she noticed his small smile. The music seemed to reach deep inside him, awakening something long forgotten. The nurse whispered softly, "Look, he's responding. He's listening." Another child, a girl who had been frightened of hospitals, began to hum along quietly. She had never sung in weeks, and yet here she was, her tiny voice blending with the piano. Sister Agnes looked up briefly, her heart full. She didn't speak a word. She just let the music do what it always did, heal. Hours passed, but the elderly nun did not grow tired. She moved from room to room, playing songs that carried different emotions. Lullabies, gentle hymns, hopeful melodies, and playful tunes that made children giggle. Some parents joined in softly, clapping or humming along. Nurses paused their work to listen, letting themselves be carried away by the sound. When she finally left the hospital that evening, many of the children and their families waved goodbye, tears in their eyes but smiles on their faces. Sister Agnes felt a deep sense of fulfillment she hadn't felt in decades. She realized that music was not just about performance or applause. It was about connection, about touching lives in ways that words could never achieve. Back at the convent, she found herself thinking about all the people she had met that day. The brave children, the parents who had stayed strong for them, the nurses and doctors who worked tirelessly. Each of them had a story, a struggle, a moment of pain. And yet, through music, she had seen smiles, hope, and even laughter. Soon, news of her hospital visit spread. More invitations came. Schools, small theaters, community centers, and even other hospitals. People wanted her not for fame, but for the healing power she carried through her music. The young girl from the town event continued helping her, arranging transportation, handling emails, and making sure the schedule allowed time for rest. Sister Agnes accepted, always careful not to overextend herself, but she found joy in each new opportunity. One afternoon, she was invited to a small concert for the elderly at a local retirement home. Many of the residents had limited mobility, some were hard of hearing, and some had forgotten many things about their past. She wondered if music could reach them in the same way it reached the children. She was unsure, but she felt she had to try. When she arrived, the hall was filled with people sitting in chairs, some leaning on walkers, some using canes, some with family members beside them. The director of the home welcomed her warmly and explained that the residents were excited to hear live music, something they hadn't experienced in a long time. Sister Agnes took her seat at the piano and began to play. She chose melodies that were familiar, songs from their youth, hymns they might remember from church, tunes from times long past. At first, the residents sat quietly, listening politely, but slowly she noticed something remarkable. A man in the corner began tapping his foot to the rhythm. A woman in the front row sang along softly. Hands that had been still for years reached out to clap. One by one, the room began to come alive. The music sparked memories, emotions, and smiles. People who had seemed withdrawn opened up, humming, singing, and even laughing. Sister Agnes's heart swelled with emotion. She understood in that moment that music was a bridge. It could connect generations, heal loneliness, and bring joy even in the most unexpected places. She realized that her own age and experience allowed her to reach people in ways that others could not. Her life's journey, every hardship and quiet day in the convent had prepared her for this. Word of this performance, too, spread quickly. Videos were shared online, and people began to see her not only as a talented pianist, but as a symbol of hope and inspiration. Teachers, parents, and even other musicians reached out to her, asking how she managed to convey such deep emotion through music. She always answered simply, "I play what I feel." The heart remembers even when the hands are old. In the weeks that followed, Sister Agnes continued to perform in places she had never imagined. Small town halls, community gatherings, charity events, and even private homes. Each time she found herself touching lives in ways that were profound yet quiet. Some people came hoping to be entertained, but they left with something more. A memory, a feeling, a reminder of life's beauty. Through all this, she remained humble. She never sought recognition, never asked for praise, and always returned to her convent at the end of the day to pray, to care for the garden, and to practice quietly in her small chapel. She understood that her gift was not hers alone. It belonged to anyone who would listen, anyone who needed to feel it. One evening, after a long day of performing, she sat by the window in her room. The sunset painted the sky in shades of orange and pink. She thought about the children in the hospital, the elderly residents at the retirement home, the students she had met in schools, and the people who had written to her online. Each story reminded her that her music had purpose. It was not about applause or recognition. It was about connection, about touching hearts and giving hope. The young girl who had first noticed her talent and encouraged her to play continued to visit the convent, bringing letters, arranging visits, and sometimes just sitting quietly with her, listening as she played. Together, they began thinking about ways to bring music to even more people, those who might never have the chance to hear it otherwise. Sister Agnes realized that her journey was far from over. The simple act of touching the piano keys, which she had once thought only brought her private joy, had grown into something larger than she had imagined. It was changing lives, inspiring others, and creating moments of beauty that might never be forgotten. And through it all, she never lost sight of the quiet purpose that had guided her life from the very beginning, to share music not for fame, but for love, hope, and the simple joy of touching another soul. Her story, once hidden in the small halls of her convent and the quiet corners of an orphanage, was now beginning to reach far and wide. People were starting to see that talent and heart do not fade with age. They grow, they evolve, and they touch lives in ways that can never be measured. Sister Agnes understood that her music was no longer just her own. It was part of a larger story, of children finding courage, of elderly people remembering joy, of hearts everywhere finding hope in the simplest of notes. And she knew quietly that as long as she could sit at the piano and play, she would continue to bring a little more light into the world. After her music began touching people in hospitals, schools, and retirement homes, Sister Agnes's life started to change in ways she never expected. She remained humble and quiet at heart, but her presence was becoming known beyond the small town she had lived in for decades. Letters, phone calls, and emails arrived almost daily. They came from people who had watched her performances online, from parents whose children had been inspired, from teachers who wanted her to speak to their students, and even from complete strangers who felt moved by the way she played. One morning, the head sister handed her a small stack of letters and said gently, "Sister, it seems the world is calling for you." Sister Agnes took the letters slowly, her hands shaking slightly as she opened the first one. Inside was a simple note from a woman she had never met, thanking her for the music she had played at the hospital. The woman wrote that her son, who had been too sick to speak, had smiled and even hummed along for the first time in weeks. Another letter came from a teacher at a small school in a distant town, asking her to visit and teach the children about the power of music. Each letter carried a story of hope, healing, and joy, and with every story her heart grew fuller. Despite the invitations and praise, she never let it change who she was. She continued her daily routines at the convent, tending to the garden, helping with small chores, and spending quiet moments in prayer. She understood that the gift she had was meant to be shared, not used for fame. One day she received a request that made her pause longer than usual. A community center in a large city wanted her to perform in a grand concert hall. They said the hall could hold hundreds of people, and the event would be attended by people of all ages. They had seen her videos and insisted that her music could inspire not just a few, but thousands. Sister Agnes thought carefully. She had never performed in such a large space before. The thought made her nervous. What if her hands could not play the same way? What if the audience did not feel the music as she intended? But she also felt a quiet calling, a sense that she had to try. She accepted the invitation. The day of the performance arrived, and the hall was magnificent. The stage was wide, with bright lights shining down, a beautiful piano at its center, and rows upon rows of seats filled with people from every walk of life. There were children, parents, elderly couples, students, and even some musicians who had come to watch appear. Everyone was talking softly, wondering what an elderly nun could bring to such a grand stage. Backstage, Sister Agnes sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap. She could hear the soft hum of the audience, the rustle of programs, the faint echo of conversation. Her mind wandered for a moment to the orphanage where she had first shared her music with children who had nowhere else to turn. She thought of the little boy who had not spoken for weeks, who now remembered her music decades later. She thought of the elderly people at the retirement home, whose eyes had lit up as they remembered songs from their youth. When her name was called, she walked slowly to the piano. The audience fell silent. She sat down, closed her eyes, and took a deep breath. The world seemed to hold its breath with her. The first notes came softly, almost cautiously, as if she were testing the waters. Then gradually the music began to grow. Her fingers moved with elegance and precision, but more importantly with emotion. Every note carried the love, hope, and care that had been a part of her life for decades. From the very first chord, the audience was captivated. People leaned forward in their seats, listening intently. Children stopped fidgeting, parents held their breath, and even the most distracted audience members could not tear their eyes away. The music was not just a performance. It was a story, a message, a gentle whisper to every soul in the hall. Tears began to flow in the audience. Some cried quietly, others openly, overwhelmed by the depth of feeling the music conveyed. For many, it was as if the notes were speaking directly to their hearts. They could feel every story embedded in each chord, the joys, the sorrows, the moments of love, and the quiet victories of life itself. The young girl who had first convinced her to play at the town event was there, sitting in the front row, her eyes wide with admiration. She clutched her mother's hand, feeling a mixture of awe and pride. "She's incredible," she whispered. "She's telling stories without words." The elderly nun continued to play, moving through melodies she had composed for children, hymns she had played in churches, and soft, reflective tunes she had written in moments of solitude. Each piece carried a lifetime of memories, lessons, and emotions. The hall felt alive, as though the music had given it a soul. Backstage, the event director watched quietly, amazed by the transformation that had taken place. The hall, once just a large space filled with people, had become a sanctuary of feeling. "It's incredible," he said softly. "She's not just playing music. She's healing hearts." The performance lasted for over an hour, yet the audience remained enraptured throughout. When she finally lifted her hands from the piano keys, the silence lingered for a few seconds. Then slowly applause began, gentle at first, then growing louder until the entire hall erupted in cheers. People rose to their feet, clapping, shouting words of admiration, and even crying openly. Sister Agnes remained seated for a moment, her hands resting lightly on her lap. She did not seek the applause, did not look for praise. She simply let the music settle in her heart and in the hearts of those who had listened. Then, with a soft, humble smile, she stood and nodded to the audience. After the performance, many people approached her. Some thanked her for the music. Others shared personal stories of how it had touched their lives. One man spoke about losing his wife months ago and how the music reminded him of the happy moments they had shared. A young mother told her how her child, who had been shy and withdrawn, smiled and laughed for the first time in weeks after listening to her play. Through all these stories, Sister Agnes realized something important. Her music was no longer just her own. It belonged to everyone who needed to hear it, everyone who found comfort, hope, or joy in its sound. She felt a deep sense of purpose, knowing that the gift she had nurtured quietly for so many years was now reaching far beyond what she had imagined. In the following weeks, invitations continued to arrive. People wanted her to play in schools, community centers, hospitals, and small concert halls. Each request was met with careful consideration, as she never wanted to overwhelm herself, but she also understood the importance of sharing her gift. One day, she received a letter from a distant country. A small charity organization had seen the videos of her performances online and invited her to play for children living in difficult circumstances, orphans, street children, and children in refugee camps. The letter explained that her music could bring hope to those who had experienced pain, loss, and hardship. Sister Agnes looked at the letter quietly. Traveling so far would be difficult, and she had never left her country before. But the thought of bringing music to those children filled her with warmth. She knew that if she could bring even a small moment of joy to their lives, it would be worth the effort. She accepted the invitation. Plans were made, travel arrangements organized, and the sisters at the convent helped her prepare for the journey. When the day arrived, she stepped onto the plane, feeling a mixture of nervousness and anticipation. She thought about the children she had once taught, the lives she had touched, and the people she had met along the way. Her heart was full of hope. When she arrived, the children were waiting, their eyes wide with curiosity. Many had never seen a piano before. She set up the instrument, adjusted the bench, and sat down. The room was quiet, expectant. Then she began to play. The first notes were soft and tentative, but soon the music grew, filling the room with warmth and light. The children watched in wonder, some clapping, some swaying, some humming along. For a few moments, the pain and hardship of their lives seemed to fade, replaced by the gentle, healing power of music. Sister Agnes played for hours, moving from song to song, melody to melody. Every note carried her love, her care, and her hope. She could see the children's faces light up, their spirits lifted, their hearts touched. And in that moment, she knew that music had no boundaries. It could travel across countries, cultures, and languages, connecting people in a way nothing else could. When she finally stopped, the children applauded, shouting words of thanks and joy. Some ran to hug her, their small arms wrapping around her in gratitude. She smiled, tears in her own eyes, feeling a sense of fulfillment that words could not capture. As she returned to her room that evening, she thought about the journey she had taken. From a small chapel in her convent to hospitals, schools, retirement homes, and distant countries, her music had touched lives in ways she had never imagined. She realized that her gift, nurtured quietly for so many years, had grown into something much larger than herself. She knew that her journey was far from over. There were still people to reach, hearts to touch, and stories to tell. And as long as she could sit at a piano and play, she would continue to share her gift, knowing that every note carried hope, love, and the power to change lives.